Okay, let's do it, shall we? And time to catch up on some of the big film choices of the week. Quite a few bits and bobs to get into this morning. Let's do it right now with our one of our resident film critics, Van Connor. Van, for our final outing on this show, of course, ending tomorrow, my friend. This is going to be our final film review together.
Oh, don't make me all emotional before we even begin, Darryl. Come on.
I know. I feel it too. I feel it as well. We've got a couple of really good films to talk about, though, tonight. One or two in particular that I am very much looking forward to. This looks incredibly intense, this first one we're going to talk about, but prescient and very important, On the Record, a new documentary film.
Yes, well, like I say, about getting emotional at the beginning, this would be very much in step with that. So this is a new documentary from Kirby Dick. Now, Kirby Dick is a documentary filmmaker I know from a few years back with a documentary about the American film rating system called This Film Is Not Yet Rated, which if you've never seen, you absolutely should. It's brilliant. Here, something a lot less jovial. This is a documentary about Drew Dixon, who is the hip-hop producer who came forward with allegations against Russell Simmons about 3 years ago now, at the height of Me Too. Now, the idea was here that basically she had created some of the most masterful works of the hip-hop genre. She'd gone away for a while, she'd come back, she'd created more masterful works, songs that you would be shocked to know were all created by the same person, music by Lauryn Hill, by Whitney Houston, and this is the story of how she effectively came forward. She was one of the few black women to come forward at the beginning of the Me Too movement, and she took on the self-proclaimed godfather of hip-hop. I've got a clip for you.
That's one of the beautiful things about the music industry. There was a lot of mobility for women, but at the same time, there was a tremendous amount of sexual harassment.
You didn't get a lot of sympathy for that. That was considered the price of admission. I didn't tell that many people about what happened with Russell. He just grabbed me. And I'm saying no. I was reduced to nothing in that moment. Nothing about anything that makes me who I am mattered.
Blimey, intense and very important subject matter, this, isn't it?
Very much so, and it's a superb documentary to chronicle it with. Now, there are elements here that, to be honest with you, I had never considered. There are elements to deal specifically with race. Me Too in and of itself is a fascinating enough subject, and Tarana Burke, one of the founders of the Me Too movement, is, there, she's present, she's on camera, she's talked to about this. But there are elements dealing specifically with African-American women and how they have had to handle Me Too in enormous separate and entirely in darker way, in a sense. The film looks at the exploration of, as it's proclaimed at one point, race loyalty versus justice, and goes into the idea and foundation of beliefs, for instance, on a cultural level, that the historic usage of sexual assault allegations against black men throughout, old American history has been used as a smokescreen to cover racial attacks. There is this innate cultural need to protect black men, and that sort of left black women on the sidelines early on in the Me Too movement, because, as we're told very early on in this, they simply didn't feel like it applied to them, which is a really horrifying way to go into this to begin with. The film then just goes even darker with it. What you wind up with is something on the level of sort of surviving R. Kelly, in which numerous alleged victims are put before us, and separately provide eerily similar details, using exactly the same lines that have been thrown their way and exactly the same manipulative moves and things like that. It's a very, very bleak film, but at the same time, a very powerful, very arresting and incredibly emotional. I broke into tears twice watching this. The thing's just 2 hours long.
I can imagine. And you mentioned there Surviving R. Kelly, and I've been on a bit of a spree of watching these kind of things lately. And we've had Leaving Neverland as well, which I watched. I know that's a couple of years back, isn't it now? Perhaps a year or two ago, but I caught up on that. And Jeffrey Epstein documentary on Netflix, which was released recently too. Mm-hmm. And there was another one I was going to mention, I can't remember. Oh, Untouchable, which was about Harvey Weinstein. And one of the reasons I think that I've watched so many of these lately, Van, as much as it is about educating myself on the subject matter, I've also been quite intrigued by how these documentaries and these accounts present themselves, because I wonder if there is a slight risk with some of these that it becomes about almost like voyeurism, if you will, for want of a better word, or sort of like a sort of ghoulish intrigue, as opposed to a genuine desire to sort of understand the horror and the feeling of the crime. Certainly one I watched about Jeffrey Epstein. I can't really say that for Leaving Neverland necessarily, and Surviving R. Kelly probably was on the right side of the line on that one, but I watched a US-based, not the Netflix documentary, but a US documentary about Jeffrey Epstein that just felt like it was all about what he did. It was all about the sort of intimate nature of what he did, which is obviously a very important part of the story, but it's very easy for you to cross that line into, as I say, for want of a better word, of voyeurism.
Absolutely. And the last few years, when we look at the way the documentaries, especially sort of true crime documentaries, have gone, they've veered towards the jovial, for instance, with the number of Fire Festival documentaries we had, and the making a murderer type shows that have almost gone for an entertainment type factor. And it is obviously a risk with this. Now, as far as as far as that risk goes in this case, there is some credibility to what you're saying. There's a controversy behind this film in particular that I only watched this film this afternoon, so I've not had a chance to look into this, but there is something of an element involving Oprah Winfrey distancing herself from the film, and it has to do with victims being added to the roster at the 11th hour, her feeling particularly uncomfortable about how it was being handled, and specific threats from Russell Simmons himself. It should be mentioned as well. I mean, Russell Simmons, like we say, is the godfather of hip-hop. He is a man who is about as untouchable as you can get in that field. The film does, however, go down a route that I think is overdue for exploration on the screen, which is the innate misogyny of the hip-hop genre. Now, the film does go out of its way to point out, no, that's not something that's unique to hip-hop, and hip-hop did not even start it. You know, every form of music, going back decades, has had this built into its DNA, and hip-hop being one of the more relatively new, longer-term genres. Obviously, you know, it's relatively new in terms of it being, say, 40 to 50 years old, but it's still relatively new in terms of being a genre that sticks around. It having that, it has taken on a cultural life of its own because it represents an entire culture in a way that very few musical genres get to do. And as befitting its representative factor, what it has to say about misogyny, what it has to say about the gender politics of the culture it surrounds, that's quite important. I think the film does a very good job of exploring that. Having said that, I do understand that is something that's, that's for another time. That's for another documentary to do. There is a lot going on here, and I do think this covers probably equal ground to the entire, say, first season of Surviving R. Kelly, but in a tighter, more compact form, and I would argue far more emotionally and insightfully as well.
And that is On the Record. And that is that how can we watch that? Is that out streaming?
On the Record is available on digital platforms this Friday, June the 26th.
When are cinemas opening? Do you know that?
Well, cinemas are allegedly opening on the 4th of July. I say allegedly open. They are in fact opening. However, they won't be showing new films. They'll just be showing films that you more than likely already have on DVD. So why is a conversation for better qualified people than I? There allegedly are not going to be any new films released for at least 20 days afterwards. That's if Disney decides to release Mulan in a climate where they're guaranteed to only make 50% of the money, because cinemas are only allowed to have 50% capacity at best. So why you'd release a film that costs several hundred million that needs to then make 2.5 times that back to break even when you're guaranteed to only make half of that is anyone's guess.
Right, okay. Yeah, work that one out.
Not cynical.
Yeah, work that out. Okay, elsewhere, Booksellers. Now, I really like the premise of this, because I am a big fan of getting lost in a bookshop. I'm not a prolific reader, to tell you the truth. I sort of read, handful of books a year, quite slowly. But I do love trawling through them, feeling them, getting involved in them. I love the sort of the mystique and the magic behind book selling. And am I right in thinking this is the documentary about some booksellers in predominantly in New York?
Absolutely. This is the new documentary from D.W. Young, narrated by Parker Posey and featuring such talking heads as Fran Lebowitz. Now, obviously, this is the kind of documentary I'm a complete sucker for. I love a documentary about a sort of collectors, a genre of collectors that I know nothing about. One of the best documentaries I've seen in recent years was a documentary about about fraud in the the rare wine community, which. Forget what, I might have been called Sour Grapes. It was really fun, and it's ripe for a movie starring Ken Jeong, if there are any producers out there listening. I'll happily write that one for you. This, though, takes place in the sort of rare bookshops that you saw most recently in the movie Can You Ever Forgive Me, with Melissa McCarthy and Richard E. Grant, and really just explores that culture, the culture of, old Jewish men running small independent bookshops in old New York in the 60s and 70s, and that culture and how it was worn away over time and gave rise to this sort of cynical, corporatized, Borders bookstore, Waterstone sort of era that we live in now. I've got a clip for you of Fran Lebowitz detailing what it was like back in the day.
One of the things I remember about those guys, they were all guys that were like all little, dusty Jewish men who were very irritated if you wanted to buy a book, because they were not really in business. They were there so they could read all day. And if it was, warm, they would be sitting outside like on a box. They were covered in dust. Their hands were yellow from nicotine. They always had glasses, of course, because they've been reading in the dark since they were, 6 years old. And if you would, go up to them and ask very politely, how much is this book? Half the time they wouldn't even look up. I always imagined I would be like that if I owned a bookstore. And you could just crawl around in there and you would find stuff. They didn't know what they had. If you could get his attention, he'd make up a price. But the price would be like 40 cents. So I like that.
Oh, it says nice. Cute.
Yeah, it sounds exactly like the kind of thing you were just describing, doesn't it, Darryl?
Yeah, it does. And so is it, is it good?
Now, to be perfectly honest, I didn't take it. I found it a little... I think this is one for people who are already in that community, people who are already sort of in the world of rare book collecting. And it's not something that's inherently arresting. It's not delivered in a way that I found completely accessible. But for lack of a better term, it simply doesn't work for layman's, I don't think. It's one for the fans only, but, fans of the dustiest books imaginable. The talking heads that are in there are pretty engaging for what they are. I found a couple of minor chuckles in there. There's one gentleman who says, I've got a degree in 16th century Spanish poetry, so naturally I'm broke. And you think, okay, that's a level of candor I can absolutely respect. They go down a route of talking about why it is that fiction, for instance, is obsessed with the idea of the rare bookseller as this sort of, this aficionado, this cultured, sexy individual, and how they're depicted in movies as these characters played by Olivia Martinez and characters like that, and Johnny Depp in was it Secret Window or one of the Ninth Gate, I think, something like that.
Yeah.
Why they always sexify these characters when in reality there's really nothing that sexy about it. They're just kind of like old short men who live in dusty, darkened rooms, and they always have a cat for some reason. There's always a cat. This is one of the defining traits of owning one of these rare bookstores. You have to have a cat. And how hipsters are sort of moving into these gentrified neighborhoods in New York and trying desperately to resurrect this idea. It doesn't quite work as far as documentaries go. Obviously very, very different subject matter, but on the record, very, very different, but vastly superior style of documentary. This feels a lot more real. This feels like something you would just find, on the A&E channel, a Tuesday night at 7:30 and think, yeah, I'll leave it on for an hour, and I think it's an hour and a half, hour and 20, something like that. And it's perfectly harmless, but you're not going to come away feeling particularly enlightened in a way that you wouldn't have before. I came out really kind of feeling numb to it because it didn't engage or arrest me or particularly inform me in a way that I couldn't have pieced together from 1,000 movies or TV shows.
Well, I've got a lot of time coming up, Van, so a bit of spare time, so I think that sounds like a good hour and a half filler for me, if not necessarily something that's going to change my life. By the way, The Ninth Gate was a terrible film.
Oh, no one said it was any good. It's a Roman Polanski movie starring Johnny Depp. How good could it possibly be?
Fair point. Fair point. Okay, elsewhere, and I'm sort of hoping this will be good. It's not really my bag, but right now we all need a lift, and I could probably get on board with it. The Eurovision Song Contest, the Story of Fire Saga. What is this? What's Fire Saga?
So Fire Saga is a fictional Icelandic band consisting of two members, Lars and Sigrid. Now, Lars is played by Will Ferrell, and Sigrid is played by Rachel McAdams. Now, this movie plays effectively like Blades of Glory at Eurovision, if you can imagine such a bonkers concept. Now, naturally, because it takes place at Eurovision, Graham Norton has to turn up. He's contractually obligated to turn up. And you know what? He's not bad, actually. He's quite engaging and fun. He sends himself up quite well. There's a great supporting cast as well that includes the likes of Pierce Brosnan in full daddy mode. You've got not one but both Demetrios. So you've got Jamie Demetrio from Stateless Flats. Statfless Flats? I can never remember how to pronounce that. Statfless Flats, I think.
Say it with confidence.
Exactly. Natasha Demetrio from What We Do in the Shadows. You've got a cast that also includes Demi Lovato and, of course, Dan Stevens from the recent Beauty and the Beast live-action adaptation. Now, the idea here is they are basically sort of rote amateur Icelandic musicians who, through curious twists of fate, circumstances that you couldn't exactly see coming, and a mysterious boat explosion that kills all of the other potential contestants, are chosen to represent Iceland at the Eurovision Song Contest. They go to the Eurovision Song Contest, which is in Edinburgh. Now, I think this was actually filmed at one of the Eurovision Song Contests. It was a whole thing. And, they are ridiculed, they are mocked, they have their own temptations and obstacles that come up along the way, and it's about this band sticking together and making it to the end. I've got a clip for you to give you just an idea of the wacky tone that's going on here.
All of Iceland think we are a joke.
That's not true.
And my father is ashamed of me.
No, he's not.
He looked me into the eyes and said, I am ashamed of you.
Maybe he was drunk.
He said, and you might think that I'm drunk, but I am dead sober.
Idiot.
Officially, Fire Saga will be representing Iceland at Eurovision this year.
I hate them.
Absolutely terrible.
They're old, disgusting people. But we have no choice.
So we're in. Yep.
It sounds terrible.
It sounds it, and I'll be really honest. I am not a Eurovision guy at all. But having said that, I'm not a figure skating guy either, and I really love Blades of Glory. Do you like Blades of Glory, Darryl?
I don't think I've seen Blades of Glory, actually. No, I haven't seen Blades of Glory.
Okay, well, with your upcoming free time, I suggest,
I'll put that in as well.
With the greatest of confidence, that you watch Blades of Glory, laugh yourself senseless, and then turn on to Netflix, watch this, and you won't love it quite as much as you love Blades of Glory, but if Blades of Glory is a 5, this is a 3, would be a nice way to say it. I mean, there's a fair bit going for it. There's a great energy to it. It's visually quite arresting. It's got, solid direction from David Dobkin, who gave us Wedding Crashers, and of course Will Ferrell, co-starred in Wedding Crashers in a sort of smaller role. He's co-written this here with David Dobkin, and also this one marks his first time, writing since Anchorman 2, and this is easily better than Anchorman 2, let's put it that way. The big success of the film for me, aside from, having a really thumpingly great soundtrack, which it kind of needs to have a wacky, colourful, kind of hilarious soundtrack because it's Eurovision, but the great success is Rachel McAdams. I think, she's always been an underrated comic performer. You look at something like Game Night, which I think popped up on Amazon Prime this last week, one of the best comedies of the last few years. Absolutely worth checking out. She's great in it, and she's great here as well. She has quite good chemistry with Will Ferrell. She's only let down by the fact that they pulled this sort of Hobbs and Shaw trick. I don't know if you ever saw Hobbs and Shaw, but they did this ridiculous idea that Jason Statham and his on-screen sister were meant to be of a comparable age, when in reality they looked about 30 years apart. Now here you've got a very similar thing with a 41-year-old Rachel McAdams, who sort of permanently looks 35 because she's just a remarkably young-looking woman anyway, and a 53-year-old Will Ferrell, who always looks like he's pushing 60. It's one of those weird things. I mean, the big star for me, after Rachel McAdams, though, is Pierce Brosnan, who's playing really against type, going kind of silly in a way that even Mamma Mia didn't quite manage. And then you couple that with Dan Stevens, who's going full flamboyant, full, sort of blonde tips, 80s George Michael, but a sort of Russian pop star in a leopard skin coat singing a song called Lion of Love. It's that level of ridiculous. I had a good time with it. I didn't think it was great. Doesn't have the sort of hit ratio on the gag front that Blades of Glory did, but, it falls, it's a sort of a three-way split between that hit ratio, A third of them hit every time, a third of them are sort of minor chuckle, and a third of them miss wildly. But as far as a comedy goes in 2020, especially a big budget, 2-hour mainstream comedy starring Will Ferrell, that's a pretty good ratio. You do a lot worse than this one.
Okay, I will slot it in to my newfound time van. Hey, it's been a real pleasure, my friend. I hope that we get to meet again on our respective new ventures. But thank you. I know that you do a lot with Paul Ross, so you will be heard here on this show when Paul's Talk Sports show becomes the Talk Radio show, etc. So. Thank you, my friend, for your time. Always a pleasure.
It's been a genuine pleasure as well, Darryl. It's been a fun year. Thank you very much for every fun moment we've gotten to share together. I think we had a good Oscar night together as well.
We did, didn't we? We did. And that will live long in the memory, that one, my friend. It was fantastic. It was like showbiz election night, wasn't it? I really enjoyed that.
Very much the way I've always called it the Film Critics Super Bowl, but yes, it was absolutely our election night as well.
Thank you, Van. Take care. Speak soon.
Till the next time, good sir.